first aid kit, trauma kit, IFAK, AFAK, MFAK, march gear, a boo-boo kit, med kit, EDC pocket kit, life-saving kit. What are all of those things? So let's talk about first aid. Before we start, I know there's already a ton of information out there about first aid and first aid kits. So why am I making videos about first aid kits? Well, I feel like a lot of the information out there, especially some of the most prevalent information, is just not really useful or practical for the average person. My goal is to make a few videos about first aid kits and what I feel is a good approach to building a kit for yourself, for your car, for your home, and just to give some of my thoughts and opinions. These are, of course, just my opinions, and if you have other thoughts or ideas, please let me know what those are down in the comments. This will be the first video in a short series about first aid kits. I didn't want to make an hour-long video about first aid, so I'll just do a few shorter videos instead. You can click up there. I'll put a link to the rest of the videos once I get them finished, or I'll put a link down in the video description. So what do you think of when you think of first aid? One of my pet peeves is that a lot of the information online is very heavily focused on trauma care. And that isn't always a bad thing. Trauma care is very important. And it makes a certain amount of sense. When people are looking for this type of information, they're often looking into prepping or survival, and they're talking about worst case scenario kind of things. And prepping for trauma makes a lot of sense in that case. Where that trauma focus causes issues, though, is when I see folks who are buying chest seals and decompression needles, and they're building an IFAK just like they saw in a video on YouTube, but that's all they have for a first aid kit. I'm not immune to this myself. Once upon a time, that was what I did for first aid kit too. I mean, I've got my IFAK here and over here. These were what I had for a first aid kit because that's what I did too. I was watching this stuff and that's what I was putting together. I've had even friends who have done this, people who have asked me, do you know where I can get IV bags or IV solution? And where can I buy sutures? And my first questions are always like, do you even know how to start an IV? What are you planning on using it for? Another pet peeve I have is with commercial first aid kits. Commercial first aid kits seem to come in two flavors. You have trauma-focused first aid kits, kind of the IFAK kind of kit, or you have the first aid kit you find in the store, the home first aid kit, says that's 120 pieces of first aid, and you open it up and it's actually 95 little tiny band-aids. I don't want you to get the idea that I think everything is bad. There is a lot of great information out there online, and there's some really good commercial first aid kits too. But I think first aid kits can be done differently. Before we go any further, what is my background in first aid? Well, I'm a registered nurse. Before I was a nurse, I did first aid training through ECSI, through Wilderness First Aid courses. Before that, I learned first aid as a Boy Scout, and before I was even a Boy Scout, I was teaching myself to do first aid, reading books. I really like first aid. I'm telling you this because I know that everyone's background and training can cause some type of bias in the way that they view things. So I want you to let me know if you feel like I have any sort of bias towards the way that I view first aid or that I put together first aid kits. Well, let's get down to the actual topic of first aid kits here. Where do we start with a first aid kit? So I'm a stay-at-home dad. I have 2-year-old twins. I have a 9-month-old going to school full-time online during a pandemic. First aid for me, and for most of you, is more likely going to mean taking care of a scraped up knee than it is taking care of a gunshot wound. I know that the most common injuries are things like strains and sprains. Household injuries are things like minor cuts and lacerations, burns, falls, bumps and bruises from falling objects. Hundreds of people die every year from avoidable things like heat and cold emergencies, or dehydration, or poisoning. I know that people die every day from anaphylaxis. So how is my first aid kit going to handle all of that? Well, the most important thing in your first aid kit is knowledge. That's really what first aid is, right? First aid is the aid that you give someone until they can get to a higher level of care. All of the actual stuff in your first aid kit, all of these things, they're just here to make first aid a little bit easier, a little bit faster, cleaner, neater, and more effective. But first, you need the knowledge to administer first aid. Now, you don't need to sign up for a combat trauma class, and I wouldn't recommend you start there. Start by getting a CPR certification. Check with the Red Cross or the American Heart Association and see if there's a CPR class near you. Check with your local community college or look online and see if you can find a basic first aid class. Or look for books. A lot of older books focus on providing first aid without all of this stuff. And I really love that knowledge. I started learning first aid by reading old Boy Scout handbooks, even before I was ever in the Boy Scouts. You could also look at getting a little first aid guide. These you can keep in your first aid kit, especially in a big first aid kit like this. I like this little guide in particular because it starts with some little survival basics, and then it goes through essentials for a first aid kit, and then it has a little walkthrough, steps to do an assessment on someone, what information you should get, what should you write down, what questions should you ask someone when you're administering first aid or when you come across someone. It even gives you some tips on things you should say to them or some things you shouldn't ask them. All of the gear in the world is not going to help you if you don't know how to use it. And you have to have the right knowledge. Knowing how to put a chest seal on a sucking chest wound is great, but that's not going to help if you don't know how to recognize and treat anaphylaxis or dehydration or hypothermia. Start by getting basic knowledge. So next time we'll go over my version of an EDC first aid kit, or a pocket first aid kit, or a backpack or diaper bag first aid kit. If you want to make sure you don't miss those, hit the subscribe button. If you enjoyed this video, click on the little like button. If you want to see some other videos, you can click over here or over there. You can click the little button up there to subscribe. Thanks for watching. We'll see you next time.